Ethnocentric views. They're half-truths, and they're very unscientific. You know why? Because you gather evidence. Firstly, you come out with a point of view, and you gather evidence to substantiate your point of view, and ignore evidence that does not substantiate your point of view. And so, therefore, so most ethnocentrists think everybody are ethnocentric. Now, there was a problem in that was what used to be sinocentrism. If you read the idea of race in China, it was ethnocentric. They believed that non-Chinese was just as good as them if they accepted Chinese culture. So they were ethnocentric. They were not racist though, because if they were racist, they believed that people who did not accept Chinese culture were inferior. But they were inferior to Greeks for that way. That's why in Greek, the Greeks, Homer looked like an Indian from India. Hesiod, I don't know what he looked like. Aesop looked like an African.
Have you seen a photograph of him?
Yes, they have photographs, but they have depictions of them. Aesop was a Negroid, definitely Negroid, but he was Greek. Now, if people read these, they don't know how to read. They don't know anything about hermeneutics. When you read the Egyptians talking about Asians and Europeans, they are not talking about people. They're talking about direction. When they talk about the Asiatics in the Middle East, now, excuse me, the Asiatics look just like them.
Greek, and I say he's African. Who's right?
Well, in that period of history, there was no concept of Africa or Europe as a continent until recently.
Okay.
There was no concept of Africa or Europe. If you lived in West Africa, excuse me, at that time, if you lived, that's why all social categories are historical social. So if you read a concept like the Portuguese set up factories in Africa, it doesn't mean they set up a GE or General Motors. Because in the 14th century, factories meant factors of trade. So when you read, you have to know the meaning of that word at that period in history. Now, do you like marks? If you use the word mark, like the German currency, which is gone out of existence, if you use the phrase mark in 1200 AD, you're talking about a German commune. The word changes. So you can, if you're reading a text, and you read somebody say something about race in the ancient world, they are not talking about biology, they're talking about ethnicity, but the word did not exist at that time.
But now my question has not been answered. How can you, being a European, not write from a European perspective? You don't have to be bigoted about it. But you can, that's what I'm saying, you would have to write from a European perspective.
I can write from a black perspective. I'm going to show you how you do it. I'm going to deal with the black perspective. During the American Revolution, they haven't taught the history of this country properly. Most people don't know, what did the Africans do during the American Revolution? They fought on the side of the British, because the British promised them freedom for slavery. Right. That's how Ivory Coast came.
Stop it with how many of them did that?
100,000 Africans, if you let me finish, I would have got to that point. 100,000 Africans out of the 600,000, because there's a book on that called Black Lawyers, incidentally, out of 600,000, mean 1 out of 6 fled to the British land or into the Indian tribes. Number 2, if it's 1 out of 6, how many children fled? How many old people? How many women? They lost their whole male supply. And that's why there were more African slaves brought in this country between 1776 and 1808 than in the previous 300 years. That's history. Number 2, I'm going to get back to the point. Now, all Africans, and you hear people writing a history of blacks in the military, before the Civil War, most of the Africans, not all of them, fought on the side of whoever was the enemy of the United States. And if they did not do that, they would not be human. Because human beings don't fight for their slave masters. So all your histories, what does Crispus Attucks, Salem, and all of them have in common? They are free Negroes. They were not slaves.
You're saying a lot, Robert.
That's the
Where do you
history.
jump
I'm telling you facts.
I'd like to clarify something.
That is not my. That's a fact. So I give you a book on each one.
May I clarify something? Several issues have been raised. One has to do with a subjective approach to understanding knowledge and history and an objective approach. Now let me begin
That's
with,
exactly right. I agree with that.
Let me begin with the understanding and the study of science, because it's easy. Then I'll go into social science. Now, when we talk about science and we practice science, we do not accuse someone of being Eurocentric or Afrocentric in the practice of science. And why is that? Because, you know, we have a shared belief system, and we have criteria and procedures that we practice and without regards to race, creed, color, or national origin. And in that sense, it's a very objective process. So there's never an issue of, and you've heard this, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, you know, white science or black science. I mean, you know, that's rather silly.
Pretty much.
Although one does, and it happens, one can bring bias to the study of science. But in social science, the errors are right. It's very easy to make a mistake. What is one common mistake that happens, say, in the study of history, for example, is that we bring our perspective. We bring our particular understanding and belief systems that have been inculcated in us simply because we were born in the 20th century,
Right.
And in the United States, and in the fact that we're in north central the United States. So when we go back and try to understand, take an example, you know, why Isaac Newton would believe so strongly in alchemy. I mean, we look at this and say, wow, this guy was really not all that smart. But that would be an error, because in his time and his social situation, that made all the sense in the world. Mm-hmm. And so we don't want to impose our belief system and our judgments and what we think is important onto other people's at other times in history. And we do that all the time. And that's the bias that you're talking about.
Right, and that's why I'm saying it's hard to not get out of that.
Implying it's inevitable that nobody's overcome. And that's not true.
But I'm saying we want you want to be aware, and so that's why empathy is so important. When you are going to understand a particular aspect of history at a particular time, you must struggle to understand the conditions and the mindsets and the belief systems of the people at that time. You know, and we do this all the time. I mean, when we talk about, for example, religious practices. Now, monotheism hasn't been around such a long time ago, but if we look at the way the Greeks, for example, practice polytheism, I mean, you know, this is their belief system. You know, monotheism, you know, had not evolved at that point. Or when we look at
monotheism came before them.
Yeah.
The Greeks are monotheism. I'm gonna tell you history. Monotheism actually started in Egypt. But
I understand,
excuse me, I'm talking about before the Greeks. Let's get our facts right.
The Greeks were not monotheistic.
I know that, but let's get the facts. You said monotheism didn't start before the Greeks.
Wait.
Excuse me, let me finish. Monotheism started with the Hebrews. Excuse me, let me finish because you made an error. Okay. Monotheism started with the Hebrews in Africa under Ethnocentric. Excuse me. But Ethnocentric died, and there was a counter-revolution against monotheism, and the Hebrews, who were not Semitic, brought monotheism to Western Asia, and therefore, contrary to the Bible, monotheism doesn't go back. Adam's all those guys' invention. Monotheism hit on the scene in the latter half of the 2nd century BC. Greek didn't come into existence unless you deal with the pre-Greeks, and they got a bias against the Mycenaean and others. But the Greeks around the time of Athens and so forth started around 600 BC.